I'm now going to pass back to Robert, who's going to introduce a big build-up again for Nick. All I know about Nick is that apparently he's a Wiltshire's history man, which hopefully doesn't put too much pressure on him. But over to you, Robert.
I went out with Nick a few days ago, and I wanted to show him the site at Hazeland, and then, of course, Hazeland Bridge. We went there, and then we went down to Stanley Holt and did a bit of walking to look at the canal as well. And I wanted Nick to talk about the area around the Hazeland site, which would be more familiar to the people, or to our friends from Bristol. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself and get going?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, okay. I've lived in Calne since I was 21 years old, back in 1983, albeit with some periods when I was in Finch Hampstead near Wokingham, and 11 years in Marlborough. I came back here in 2002. So I've been around for quite a while, and I've spent over half my life in Wiltshire. Whether that makes me a Wiltshire history man or not, I don't know. But I've certainly got a great interest in history. I did a master's degree at Ruskin College in public history back in the 90s. And actually, Ian Thorne, I have met you before. We had a discussion about the fact they spelt Macaulay Square wrong and Dunstan Close wrong some years ago. You might remember. So, you know, I'm an enthusiast. I'm quite happy to start. I hope you can all hear me all right. And I'm very interested in the controversial stuff about Calne, and there's lots of it. So with no further ado, I'll just bring up my PowerPoint. Okay, start at the beginning. Always a good place to start. And I'm very conscious, let me just go back, I've gone too far. Right, I'm very conscious that Avon needs trees, is absolutely right. And there you can see Hazeland Wood on your right there.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
You haven't shared the screen yet.
I haven't shared the screen. How do I do that? Let me just thank you ever so much, Tim. This is not my greatest feat, I'm afraid. Are we doing okay now? Can you see now? I'm glad you're with me. Is everybody? I don't know how I'd know if I'm not doing this right, but okay. So I hopefully we'll be all right now. So I was very conscious, thanks to Robert, who kindly asked me very nicely on Monday this week if I put together a talk for this evening. So it's probably one of the fastest talks I've ever produced. A bit of a challenge. I was very conscious that we really ought to start at Hazeland because this is the gem that we're focusing on, really, isn't it? And it isn't just about Calne, it's also about Chippenham and the rivers in between, obviously, and the railway in between, which is my brief. So I'm starting here, and I want to start with the moment on Tuesday, the 25th of June, 1861, when the local Calne MP, Mr. Robert Lowe, cut the first sod for the Calne Railway. I'll tell you more about that as we get into this. But I think it's important to give you some kind of background because the railway didn't just come overnight. There are lots of reasons for it, as indeed you'll find out in the next talk for the canal. And I want to take you back to the 17th century so you can be aware of just how important this area was in terms of trees. Pewsham Forest, Blackmore Forest, effectively one vast forest that went from the Marden to Melksham and headed towards the Devizes as we call it now, bordered to the west by the River Avon and to the north by the River Marden. And you can see Carriage Brook coming in there. But what I really like about that map, apart from it shows you just how significant this forest was and the importance of Calne and Chippenham in between, at each edge of that, and I quite deliberately pronounce those places the way they are on that map. Chippenham didn't exist in 1610, it was Chippenham. And you'll find a lot of local people in Calne call it Chippenham to this day. In fact, calling Calne was regarded as rather a posh way of saying it. I can remember when I moved here in 1983, I was berated by my sister-in-law at the age of 21. You don't call it Calne, only posh people and foreigners call it Calne. It's Calne. I thought I'd like to start the talk with that. Okay, by the 18th century, the A4, which is called, became the preferred route between London, Bath and Bristol. But you'll see from that map, the roads marked in red, which I've planned in for you, show the main coaching routes that existed up until the 18th century. The old one that went above Headington and on to Sandy Lane Laycock and Bath in one direction, and the other one went via Devizes and Seamed onto Bath that way. But Calne was becoming part of the new preferred route, the state-of-the-art turnpike road that really turned the town round and put it on the map, as it did with Chippenham. By 1802, of course, as you'll find out in the next talk, Calne was on the National Canal Network. You can see this rather nice drawing produced round about the time that Samuel Taylor Coleridge lived in Calne, from 1815 to 1816. Railways were relatively new and they weren't trusted. And really what changed all that was George Stephenson's win at the Rainhill Trials with his amazing locomotive called the Rocket. Up until then, it was considered difficult, if not impossible, to harness steam power to moving objects. This changed all that. And the first intercity railway in the world was opened the following year between Liverpool and Manchester in 1830. Sadly, they hadn't invented platforms. The president of the Board of Trade, Mr. William Huskinson, MP, was killed by a train on the opening day. So about time we invented platforms, isn't it? So coming back to our own area then, I suppose you've got an intercity line. Why not have an intercity line between London and Bristol? And surely that would follow the turnpike road, wouldn't it? It would go through Hungerford, Marlborough, Calne, Chippenham and so on. Sadly it didn't, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Brunel didn't like the terrain, he didn't like the gradients, and wasn't helped by the fact the Marquis of Aylesbury and Marlborough put his foot down and said no way was he having any engines or trains or steam locomotion coming anywhere near his Savanac Forest. So that put the kibosh on that. But it was really Brunel's idea of a billiard table to avoid the gradients. So in 1841, the Great Western Railway from Swindon to Bristol via Swindon was completed. And obviously, for people in Calne, people in Marlborough, people on those places that the Great West Railway bypassed were left out in the cold. GWR didn't mean Great Western Railway for people in Marlborough and Calne. It meant the Great Way Round, because it finished off the coaching trade that was at that time highly prosperous. And of course, as we all know, in Calne, in 1770, Harris's started off. Pigs were brought in from Ireland. They were driven to Smithfield, London, in London, Smithfield Market in London. Some of them were knocked on the head when it was considered they wouldn't make the journey. And the Harris family started a very lucrative bacon curing business, which by the mid-19th century was becoming quite profitable, as you can see from this illustration showing one of the early factories in the 1860s. Charles Harris had one, Thomas Harris had another. And you can see belching out smoke. So no doubt coal was coming in by canal, but they needed a bit more than a canal to get their animal products out. So a shift, we need to be put back on the loop. We need to have our connections with the National Railway Network. It's very important to do that. So three former mayors, John Nelson Ladd, Charles Harris and Thomas Harris and others, persuaded the people of Calne to petition Parliament, to pass an Act of Parliament to authorise a railway line to connect Calne with the Great Western Railway at Chippenham, which they duly did in 1860. The Calne's Member of Parliament, quite a significant character, Robert Lowe. He'd been MP for Kidderminster, became MP for Calne. Sainsbury's toast him at their AGM every year because he brought in financial reforms, limited stock companies. I'm not an economist, I couldn't tell you exactly what he did, but he was a brain box. And he was brought into education, and in 1862 passed the revised code, which brought in payment by results, government inspectors and all the rest of it. So while he was MP for Calne, he recognised the importance of a railway, pushed for it and bought shares. And there we are, he was given the invitation to cut the first sod for this new railway, turn the first sod, if you like, given the invitation, because the Marquis of Lansdowne said no. And I wonder perhaps the Marquis of Lansdowne perhaps thought the railway wasn't going to work out, it was going to be a bit of a white elephant. Well, it may be, to be fair to him, that he considered that perhaps he was getting a bit old for this sort of thing and rather somebody else did it. So anyway, Mr. Lowe was given a spade and off he went to a field to cut the first sod, and the field was very close to Studley. They did not want the town to be shut out from the world. And the spot selected for the ceremony was a field at study belonging to Mr. Angel, very near that gentleman's residence. And Mr. Lowe was provided with a neat mahogany wheelbarrow and highly polished spade. And there we see Hazelden Wood, look, so you are. This is all going on in full view of Hazelden Wood in 1861. And Mr. Lowe takes his coat off and off he goes. It's pouring rain, by the way. It's a June day, but it's very, very wet. There's only about 150 people in attendance. And they've had to walk from Calne, bearing in mind, so quite an effort. There you are, everybody's cheering. He's dug the first sod, he's placed it in the wheelbarrow and wheeled it along a plank. And it's all gone off very well. Sadly, I couldn't find a picture of Mr. Lowe digging the first sod, but I did find a picture of Lord Ernest Bruce from the Illustrated London News cutting the first sod for the Swindon, Marlborough, Andover Railway at Cold Harbour Meadow in Marlborough in 1873. Mr. Lowe was in his shirt sleeves. Lord Ernest Bruce, as you can see, didn't even take off his top hat. You can see it's a bit of a carnival event. Okay, Harris's pushed for the railway. They subscribed over half the capital, and needless to say, their station was to become instrumental for the success of their business. Opened in 1863 to public acclamation, I thought I'd give you perhaps a better idea of the route of the railway. You see, coming out of Chippenham, diversion at Cocklebury, making its way across that flat river expanse to the first halt, opened in 1905, by the way, at Stanley Bridge. And then on to Black Dog, which I'll tell you a bit more about, as Robert's quite keen to hear, and I'm sure you all are, and on to Calne. I don't need to say much about Stanley Abbey, that's good, thanks to Tim. That'll cut out a little bit of this talk. So let's go on a virtual tour. This is 1886. This is Chippenham Station. We're on a train to Calne. The ironworks opposite, which are to end up as Westinghouse later on, is disused. But nevertheless, Chippenham's done extremely well out of the Great Western Railway. And it's interesting to think that Calne was more important than Chippenham until the Great Western Railway came there. That's how important the railway was to be. You know, historically, Calne was actually bigger than Chippenham until around about this time. Something people don't realise. So we're coming out of Chippenham, we're going on northeast, and then we're turning off at Cocklebury onto the Calne Railway. Okay, then we're going down a gradual gradient, down into the River Valley to cross the River Avon at the Black Bridge, which was originally built in wood. It must have looked like something you'd see out of North America. You know, it almost looked like a cowboy bridge. It was very quickly realised you had to rebuild it in iron, which was done, and then reconstructed in 1920. As you can see, the stone there that still sits in situ reminds us of that salient fact. You can get a clue from the piers there at the bottom of the black piers that the Black Bridge was called the Black Bridge simply because it was black. Today we have this sustainable transport cycle route, which I go on at least 3 or 4 times a week on my bike, trying to keep fit. It's a great route. Sadly, I can't go to the history centre as I used to do quite so often because obviously it's shut. It's not shut, but you have to book it and all the rest of it. But it's one of my favourite cycle routes. So there we are. We've crossed the River Avon. We're going gradually uphill again, away from the valley. Long, straight stretch. Oh, by the way, Scott's Mill's on there. We had a question earlier, didn't we? So I just thought I'd put that in just by chance. A corn mill, which is close to Titherton Lucas, or West Titherton as it used to be called. And I like that. I had to stop for a breather, saw these horses, that looked rather nice. And you can see Bencroft Hill in the background. Across that large expanse of fairly flat land. Quite atmospheric, I think. And you can see the white horse in the other direction. Not that white horse, by the way, the one cut on the hillside. And here we come to Stanley Bridge. It looks just like the kind of bridge I have on my model railway, to be honest. It is that archetypal country village, isn't it? With its brick course arch and its colossal stone structure. Very solid, very robust. So you go through the bridge, and then, unfortunately, you can't go any further, so you get your bike onto Studley Road via Pound Farm to continue your journey until rejoining the railway later on. And you might think, hang on, there's no station at Studley Bridge on this map, is there? That's because it wasn't built until 1905. So I gave you another map, the 1924 Ordnance Survey map, which shows Stanley Bridge Halt. That's what it looks like today. I was there, thank you, Robert, with you on Monday, and Robert pointed out that those trees, apple trees, may well have grown where they are by people throwing apples out of the train windows. And to be honest, I've thought about that, and it seems perfectly logical. Why not? I have a postcard which shows that view in about 1910. There it is. That's the same view as you would have seen 110 years ago. Stanley Bridge Halt with its pagoda-style roof, its gas lights. You know, this is the idyllic country halt. Fantastic place. And there are Stanley Bridge Halt and Stanley Bridge in the same photographs. I thought that was rather nice. Headed towards Chippenham from the cab of a diesel train. I've acknowledged the Calne Heritage Centre. I should have pointed out, I've been in the committee for the Heritage Centre since 2015. And until this year, I was involved in doing walks and talks for the Heritage Week. So I'm quite proud to have done all that and to have met Tim and reinvigorated this place's history. So we carry on our journey in Stanley Mill. You can see there, we talked about Stanley Mill, Tim did a minute ago. I won't say too much about the canal features that you've got there, the Aqueduct, the Stanley Lock, which I had the pleasure to visit with Robert earlier in the week, Carpenter's Bridge. The branch to Calne is the bit on the right. I said I wouldn't say too much, that's all I'm going to say. But I will say, you're carrying on your bike past Rose Villa cottages, which are now called Rose Cottage. And you go past, or you go close to the milepost Calne 3 miles, which they had along the railway every mile. You won't see the canal crossing like that now. Studley Bridge, you wouldn't notice unless you knew there was a canal there formerly. You can still see the line of the canal. You get off your bike, there's a little car park there. You push your bike through, there's a gate, and you go across what was once the railway bridge over the canal. And that's it. That was the railway bridge. And you can see at the forefront, you can see what looks like a paved area. I'm trying to use my arrows to show you. Can you see that? Just before you get to the gate, it looks like a paved area, isn't. That's the top of the wall that held the railway bridge across the canal. It's still there. And I'll be honest with you, I only recently noticed that, almost by accident. So off you go. It's a wooded area now. It wasn't wooded in 1886. This was very open, and it was going through what was the precincts of Stanley Abbey. There we have Abbey Farm Bridge. This one doesn't have bricks in the arch, it's actually just rough, coarse stone. Because Calne was rich with rag stone from various quarries around the town. It was easy to get building stone in by this time. You had the canal, of course, while they were building the railway. But I think it's quite idyllic, but it would not have looked like that 120 years ago. It would have been much more open. You would not have had all that foliage. And there we have the field where the main part of Stanley Abbey was. The Abbey Church, the cloisters, the refectory, the dormitories, the outhouses, the bakehouse, the prior's lodging, all these buildings would have been in that space. And around it, as Tim showed on one of his maps, you would have had the watercourses, the fish ponds, and all the rest of it. And certainly there was a second mill, which I'll try and hint at in a minute. And you can see with these sort of dotted areas to the left of the map where the watercourses were. The railway went over the drains, over the channels, and then through into Great Bodnage Copse and on towards Hazeland. You can still see this in the centre there, this watery ditch. It's more than a ditch, it's a channel that continues on and joins other channels and joins on to the Marden and joins on to fish ponds. It's quite a complex of medieval waterways and waterworks that it's quite difficult to work out. Harold Breakspear excavated the abbey back in 1907, but that's a long time ago, isn't it? Perhaps we need a bit more recent work. And across the other side of the railway line, it's difficult for you to convince you people of this, admittedly, but there is a course of a ditch that goes along here, and there's no question about it. There was a second mill in that area. You know, one thing that perhaps Tim didn't mention was that when the abbey was founded by Queen Matilda in 1151, it was actually founded at Loxwell on the top of the hill near Nash Hill. And then there wasn't enough water, so they came down into the valley, and they had water drains that actually took water down with them. So it's quite complicated. Anyway, enough of that. I'm not going to go on about it. These are, again, other features, courses. There's a bank across here. There are fish ponds in this area. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about Stanley Abbey, but it's so important, isn't it? You're on a railway line that's taking you through the medieval landscape. You're on the edge of this great Pushan forest with its boundary on the Marden, on the boundary meadow, which is what Marden means, as Tim said earlier, absolutely right. And to the north of all this, you have Braden Forest. You know, John Aubrey said a stag could go from Gloucestershire to the New Forest in Hampshire without hardly ever leaving the shade of trees in the 17th century. We do need trees, I absolutely agree with that. And here we have the 2-mile milestone or mile post at Hazelden Bridge. So we're back to the start of my talk now, really, where Robert Lowe would have been. He would have been somewhere in this area, in this field of Mr. Angels, for that ceremony to cut the first sod back in 1861. And there's Hazelden Bridge, this time with a brick arch facing onto it. I love that ride. I never ever tire of riding my bike along there. And there we see what it might have looked like with a train passing under it, pulling a goods train. I've not come across any evidence that there was any turntable at Calne stations. They must have actually pulled and pushed their trains from one direction to another. And that's the seat that I often sit on overlooking Hazelden Bridge. I often stop there, and I'll be honest, I'm a bit out of breath. I might stop and have a drink, have a look at my phone, just chill out and enjoy and watch the herons that you see along there. And one day I can remember feeling intensely that I was being watched. And suddenly I saw from across the river a deer looking straight at me. So it's an amazing place to visit. Never ever tire of it. Well, another thing I ought to have mentioned is that this ground between the sheep and the woods and the river was water meadows. You can quite clearly see hatches, panes, water courses that, you know, that date back to the 17th century when you kept the ground frost-free by keeping it enveloped with a thin covering of water to prevent frost, to enable grasses to grow early, to keep the sheep fed. So important. We live in the county of chalk and cheese, don't we? And they are related. You keep the grasses growing, you keep the sheep fed, you get the crops growing because the sheep fertilise the dung on chalk downlands, chalk and cheese. I should have mentioned on the map, there's a little bridge here that goes over. It's a space for the animals to go through. This is very much for farmers. Farmers would allow their animals to cross the railway line safely through this bridge here, and the ironwork is still there. Like sewage works, Tim mentioned diphtheria, typhoid, lovely things like that. Absolutely right. People died in droves in the 19th century of those kinds of rather nasty illnesses, diseases. Even cholera wasn't unknown. You know, I've done research at Marlborough College, and boys died there in the 1840s. So it's not surprising that by 1881 there was a need for sewage works. We take these things for granted, don't we? Waterworks, again, the same period. These were only 5 years old when this map was produced. So on past Conager Farm sewage works, you can see in the top left-hand corner here a part of the sewage works today. Interestingly enough, my father-in-law worked there. Before that, he worked for Harris's, cutting the backbones out of the pigs. So I suppose I'm an adopted Cownite in many ways. On through Searchers Wood we go, towards Black Dog. And there's a mill there, new mill there was, not much left of it now, I don't suppose, which could be seen from the railway. I should have mentioned back there, I should have mentioned just very briefly, but I didn't. The aqueduct here, by the way, this isn't the River Marden, this is the Carriage Brook that the aqueduct goes over. The River Marden actually parts company from the Carriage Brook and carries on towards Black Dog, so I better mention that. So, new mill, Studleybrook Farm, the Black Dog Bridge, which some of you may remember. I don't remember it. I first saw Calne when I visited in 1982 and I came to live here in 1983, first time round. But there was a pub called the Black Dog up Black Dog Hill, and I'll confess I don't know exactly where it was. I'm sure some of you may do, but bearing in mind I've only had a couple of days to prepare this. But there was a Black Dog pub, and I do remember reading about lots of alcohol-related problems back in the 19th century. It seemed to be a kind of nefarious, notorious drinking den. with rather an interesting reputation. And that's what it looked like. And thanks to Tim, I even have a colour photograph of the Black Bridge, taken from Black Dog Halt, named after this notorious drinking den. And it was at Black Dog, and I thought about this because it didn't open, the Black Dog station, the halt there, didn't open until 1874. So this is like 11 years after the railway started. But obviously it predates Stanley Bridge halt. But of course, Calne Railway was built in broad gauge, 7 foot wide. Then in 1873, it was converted to standard gauge, 4 foot 8 1/4 or whatever it was. Now, Brunel had lost the argument on this. And of course, if you narrow the track, and this is a single gauge track, isn't it? Single line track, you've got more room. So all of a sudden, there would have been room for a small station here that probably wouldn't have been the case before. And I think that's probably why the Marquis of Lansdowne, now realising how significant this line was, thought, yeah, I could have my own station there, which he duly did. A private station, which he let the public use, but no name board. There were no name board until after the railways were nationalised, and as late as 1952, before people actually knew what the name of that station was. And there's the waiting shelter that the Marquis of Lansdowne allowed the public to use at his private station, Black Dog Halt. And again, thanks to Tim, I can actually show you some pictures with trains on it. It brings it to life, doesn't it? There was a siding, by the way. The siding, I should have mentioned, ran along next to the line. This space wasn't siding land, this was. You get a better idea in a minute with another picture, I'll show you. The DMU, diesel multiple unit, I remember going to school on there. I'm not in Calne, I'm hastened to add, I don't come from here, I come from a place called Stansted in Essex, and I took the train to Bishop Stortford on a DMU back in the 1970s. So I remember travelling on these things. They are, you can just about see what it would have looked like. It had its own station master, he had his own coal allowance, he had his own station house, and he had to deal with the visitors to Bowood, aristocratic visitors. There was even a cabinet office meeting held in the siding during the First World War. The Marquis of Lansdowne at that point was in government, so you know, significantly important person at that time. And there's my bike, and you can see the house in the distance, the station house. And interesting enough, when it was nationalised, the station, it's a private station, and in fact, before it was nationalised in 1930, when the Great Western Railway ran it, I should point out that it was Calne Railway Company that ran the line, even though, well, they didn't run it, they owned the line until 1892, when the Great Western bought them out. The Great Western had always run it for them anyway, so effectively it's Great Western Line. Let's move on. That's a lovely photograph, I think. Thank you, Tim. As you can see, the station house, and you can see a train in close proximity, you know, absolutely idyllic. And there we have passenger coaches and pig trucks headed from Black Dog towards Calne in the 1950s. Mixed coaches, mixed trains, of course. That's how you made it work, passengers and freight in the same train. And those posts along the sides of the track you can still see. It's amazing. You think they'd have rotted away years ago, wouldn't you? But these wooden posts are dating back before 1965. You know, it's unbelievable, isn't it? And then, how many people today know that Pin Hills had a manor house, which is moated, still moated. But in 1643, this place was defended because in December 1643, 6 months after the Battle of Roundway Down, Pin Hills Manor was defended by Colonel Blake and his men, and they tried to resist an attack by the Royalists. When they saw how many Royalists there were, they promptly surrendered. The Alamo, it wasn't. But you're looking at, through a period of history, remember this is 17th century history, 17th century Water Meadows, medieval abbey, medieval forest, all within a few miles. And the last stretch, if you like, on into Calne itself. And of course, the connection with Harris's is instrumental because that station needs to be enlarged. It's not big enough to cope with the increase in traffic brought about by the Harris's business, which is going from strength to strength. In 1887, I think it was, Charles and Thomas Harris joined forces became C&T Harris Limited. So instead of having a factory in High Street and a factory off Church Street, they joined them together. And they went from strength to strength. So in 1895, they enlarged the station. This is what it looked like in about 1904. The signal box there. This is about 1890, I would guess. The goods yard, you can see, packed to capacity. The enlargement seemed to consist of the extra siding in the front foreground and the addition of a cattle market. It wasn't just pigs they were dealing with, they had regular cattle markets as well. And the water tank, and away from there was where the signal box was. So by the 1930s, two new factories, completely new factories built in the Calne town centre, which I'm sure many of you can remember. You can see each of these wagons has a sign on it to go via Southampton or to be worked via Paddington, which is the one further along the platform. So obviously when these trucks got into, say, Chippenham, one would have joined a train going one way, others would have joined a train going another way. You know, the whole railway network would have been run like a military operation with these wagons going to their right destination, almost like a kind of postal service, 1-to-1 scale. You know, it would have been a military operation. They even employed a cleaner to sort these, clean these boards every day, brought in from Chippenham. So there you are. And they brought in steam rail cars because they didn't necessarily need huge trains for passengers, but they needed enough of them to make the service viable. So they brought in shorter trains, steam rail cars in 1905. And few people know this, but originally, yes, they wanted a line to Calne, but many wanted that line to carry on to Marlborough. And there were serious plans to build a railway up through Cherrell. And people might think, oh, come off it, Nick, you're on to one here. Actually, as I'm sure you may hear in the next talk, originally when they built the Kennet and Avon Canal, the Great Western Canal during the Napoleonic Wars was originally planned to go through a flight of locks down Cherrell and onto Calne and follow the Marden and join the Avon at Chippenham. In the end, it went via Devizes. So that idea of having a railway that went further than Calne, more than just a branch line, didn't happen. But the GWR did ensure that there was a bus service to connect with the trains at Marlborough and the trains at Calne. And this chap here on the right had his legs blown off in the trenches, which is quite sad, isn't it? You can see that because he's got artificial legs. That gives you an idea of what the 20s must have been like for some people. But there you are, that bus service, it's off its way on its way to Marlborough High Street. No doubt to the station after that. But of course, the Second World War was to change all this with the RAF camps at Yatesbury and Compton Bassett, the radio operators' school, where people from all over the country in the RAF are trained to use radios. They all came to Yatesbury, they all came to these camps, the RAF camps, and it brought lots and lots of traffic in. They came by train, they went back by train, they needed fuel, coal, all the things they needed came by train. So it would have been a very busy branch line during the Second World War and in the immediate years afterwards as these camps were still around. But of course, sadly, the camps closed in the 1950s. Harris's began using road transport. There was an ASLEF strike in 1955, which probably didn't help the railway much. And it was just a very, very bad decade for the line. Without the RAF bases, competition from roads, things weren't looking good. Even though they brought in DMUs, diesel multiple units, the shorter trains, ideally suited for branch lines, they brought them in 1958. It wasn't enough to turn the tide. And inevitably, Calne was top of the list in the Beeching Report, 1963. One of my photographs, I'm quite proud to be able to say, because it shows you the front end of a DMU there by the shed there. Goods services were drawn in 1964 and passenger services on the 18th of September 1965. Apparently, it made the largest loss of any line in Britain per mile. My wife, actually, she tells me as a 3-year-old girl, she remembers being on that last train. So that brings it back, doesn't it? Just how significant that must have been, how heartrending it must have been for local people. On my postcards, I'm quite proud. It's not the best of views, but it gives you an idea of what it was like in the 1960s. Another of my photographs. And as for Harris's, of course, they went on by road for all sorts of reasons, which I won't dwell on, but they did. So that it was a contributory factor, without any doubt, to the death of the Calne Railway. They effectively brought the railway in the first place, perhaps didn't do enough to stop it being closed in the 60s. And Harris's itself, I took that photograph in about 1983, 84. I probably hadn't been living in Calne very long. I remember taking it with a Kodak Instamatic camera and thinking, my goodness, you can see that church tower again. If you think back to the beginning of the talk, when I gave you that coloured etching of the first lock at Calne looking towards the church, you can see how the church tower would have dominated the town. It dominated again after Harris's was demolished. So thank you very much. That's really the last slide. If you have any questions, I will do my level best to try to answer them. Thank you.
Nick, thank you very, very much indeed. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And I have to say, as somebody with a passing interest in politics, your reference to Robert Lowe and a quick check of Wikipedia as you were speaking would indicate that he was an absolutely central and significantly central figure in Victorian politics. And I think was Chancellor of the Exchequer at one point in one of Gladstone's governments. So,
Home Secretary as well, that's right.
Home Secretary, so well worth another look at Robert Lowe on top of all the other points that you made. Do we have any questions for Nick, please? I'm looking for people putting their literal hands up as I flick through my screen. It says, Robert, can you see anybody wanting to ask a question?
No, I can't, Ian. I'm looking.
Well, Nick, can I say thank you very much? I mean, again, I think it was such a tour de force, rather like Tim's presentation, that it leaves, it's the sort of thing where we'll wake up in the middle of the night with a question we need to ask you. So I think we might do that if we need to over the next couple of days. But I thought it was absolutely fascinating. As I say, just that reference to Robert Lowe, I thought made it all worthwhile on top of all the other details. So Nick, thank you very, very much indeed.